Um, our program today is a part of a larger effort at Perry World House to feature more human rights specific work, activism, thought leaders, and scholarship. Ken Roth's time with us as the inaugural Thakor Family Global Justice and Human Rights Visiting Fellow has been and continues to be invaluable. We're grateful to Humal Mirani and Paratosh Thakor for their support of this incredible opportunity, without whom we would not be able to hold this program today. Our program today will examine how the Chinese government represses human rights at home, its efforts to use the international system and its position internationally to undermine human rights abroad, including through the United Nations system, and what can be done about it, most importantly. You all will have longer bios online, but it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guests today. Kenneth Roth is the Thakor Family Global Justice and Human Rights Visiting Fellow at Perry World House. He served for nearly 3 decades as the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading international human rights organizations, which operates in over 100 countries. He's also my former boss. Gadi Epstein is the Economist eyewitness editor, responsible for commissioning narrative stories that deepen our understanding of the news events around the world. Previously, he was China's China Affairs editor, writing about China's growing influence globally, U.S.-China relations, and human rights, including a cover story on the atrocities committed against the Uyghurs. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Ken to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, LaShawn. It's a pleasure to be here at Perry World House again. It's been a wonderful opportunity to spend parts of this year here. And so it's, I also am just grateful for all of you. It's a nice turnout to have the chance to talk about this important topic. Now, the title is, China's threat to human rights at home and abroad. I'm not going to dwell on the at home, because I think the at home is pretty much known. That is to say, I think most people today are aware that the Chinese government has detained, some 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims to force them to abandon their religion, their culture, and their language. It has ripped up the one country, two systems agreement for Hong Kong and really crushed the considerable freedoms that had been enjoyed there. Chinese civil society virtually is no more from the perspective of people who are allowed to group together to put pressure on their government to address various public policy issues. That's pretty much come to an end. The rule of law, there had been kind of movement toward the rule of law 2 decades ago. That's gone. Just yesterday, 2 human rights lawyers were given lengthy prison terms. The various ethnic groups, beyond the Uyghurs, are themselves facing serious problems. The Tibetans have for a long time, but even the Mongolians. There is increasing pressure to just conform to Han Chinese culture, but also really to Communist Party rule. So that I'm going to accept as kind of largely a given. I'm happy to come back to that more in the discussion. But what I really want to focus on is, given that the Chinese government has chosen this path of repression to maintain its rule, what does this mean for China's relations with the world? And let me sort of begin with a word about Xi Jinping. Because Xi Jinping, I think, presents a fairly deceptive image. He presents himself as this tough guy, is very confident, is in charge. But I think if you look at the way he acts, and this is not, cheap psychology, this is just like, looking at how he acts, this guy is running scared of the Chinese people. And I say that because, it's not simply the sort of the corruption purges of people like Bo Xilai and various, perceived adversaries. It's that he's terrified that there might be, another Tiananmen Square pro-democracy uprising. You saw this in his rapid response to the anti-COVID lockdown protests, that his fear is a color revolution. He shares this with Putin, I should say. And so his entire rule is designed to prevent people from gathering together and speaking out about public issues. It's to keep the population atomized and unable to rally any kind of opposition to his rule. And that has presented a legitimacy problem for the Communist Party and for Xi Jinping. Because if you say, well, why are you the president of China? He doesn't have a great answer. He can't say, well, I was elected in a free and fair election. I mean, that's, laughable. That didn't happen. He tends to say, I'm popular. The Chinese people want me. This is what they prefer. But then, when you scratch the surface on that, you realize, well, yes, he probably does have a degree of popularity because there's this intense system of censorship and propaganda. It's very much a controlled information environment. And wherever that degree of informational control has not existed, when the people of China have actually been able to express their preferences, it has not been to applaud the concept of the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. Exhibit A for this is Hong Kong. That's the one part of Beijing-controlled China where people have had some freedom to speak out. And they, took to the streets by the hundreds of thousands to say that they did not want Communist Party rule. So given this legitimacy problem, the Chinese government puts enormous emphasis on international recognition of, if not its legitimacy, at least the fact that it's a respected government, looking out for its people, somebody who should be taken seriously. And the implicit message is, look, at everybody else thinks that I'm the legitimate leader of China. You domestic people in China should treat me the same way. It's never explicitly stated that way, but there is this, importance attached to that. And you see this emphasis in how the Chinese government treats the rest of the world. The Belt and Road Initiative, the $1 trillion initiative that is described as an infrastructure development program, is in fact, a massive effort to purchase support for the Chinese government in international arenas. And there's much talk about BRI being, no strings attached, by which they mean, none of the classic World Bank requirements of transparency and participation of civil society and a free press that can scrutinize development projects. None of that is required. But the one big string that is attached is you have to vote with China in international fora. And this has been, a very powerful tool. I remember meeting with Imran Khan a few years ago to talk to him about Xinjiang. And he kind of said, look, I can't talk about that. China owns me. But the difficulty, of course, China faces now is that it's run out of funds. It does not have the money that it used to have to shower on the world. It has contributed to this debt trap problem in many countries. These days, particularly because COVID has accentuated the debt problem, there are more and more low-income countries that are having trouble with their debt. And the Chinese government is unwilling to take losses. So they actually are holding up efforts to restructure debt because everybody else is willing to take a loss and China isn't. So this as a tool to buy support is less successful. The Chinese government has also been very good at using access to its market, or more precisely, threat of denial of access to its market, as a way of globalizing its censorship, of saying that, if you criticize us, if you bring up difficult topics, we are going to cut off your access. So this is what happened to Australia when it had the audacity to seek an independent international investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Was it the lab leak? Was it, the failure to regulate the wildlife trade and the market? China doesn't want to go there. It was frozen food, leave it at that. And so, suddenly tariffs for all these Chinese exports, or all these Australian exports, were lifted substantially. A few years ago when Liu Xiaobo got the Nobel Peace Prize, even though, the Nobel Committee is a completely non-governmental committee, it just happened to be based in Oslo, they retaliated against Norway and Norwegian salmon. So there is this, very active effort to terrify people with economic loss if they bring up inconvenient aspects of Chinese behavior. And of course, there are lots of corporate or, private examples of this, with probably the best known one being the NBA. when the general manager for the Houston Rockets, had the audacity to tweet support for the pro-democracy demonstrators in Hong Kong, and suddenly the NBA's television rights to China were abandoned. So, this does silence global criticism. It does, get people reluctant to vote against China in international fora, but it doesn't exactly breed love. It breeds resentment. And so this is not, I think it's a tactic of diminishing returns. So what I'd like to do is to look a little bit at what the Chinese government is doing these days at the conceptual level to try to undermine efforts to scrutinize its human rights records, particularly at the United Nations, which is what it cares about foremost, because you can deride the United Nations, but the truth is that something like the Human Rights Council is still the foremost global body that addresses human rights issues. And the Chinese government is desperate to avoid condemnation by the Human Rights Council. So they've done a few things. One is they have tried to redefine what human rights are. Now, typically if I get asked what are human rights, you say, well, there are these treaties. There's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There's the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. It's all in treaties. You just read the treaties. That is not the Chinese answer these days. Now, it should be no surprise that they're not interested in civil and political rights because they fail miserably there. Do they allow a free press? Do they allow civil society? Do they allow due process? Of course not. So they don't even want to touch that issue, even though respect for civil and political rights is a very important way for the public to regulate how their government behaves, how they're treated, how their needs are addressed. Back in Soviet times, people used to say, oh, well, the West, they're interested in civil and political rights, and the Soviet bloc, the East, they promote economic and social rights. Now, that was always a bit of a farce because it's not as if the Soviet system did a great job of delivering economic and social rights either. It was pretty bad at that. But there was just this ideological divide. What's interesting about China today is they also don't want to talk about economic and social rights. Why? Because, this is being a little simplistic here, but economic rights require, in essence, that you look at how the worst off segments of society are faring. Is the government allocating available resources to ensure that the basic needs of the worst off segments of society are met? That is not a question the Chinese government wants you to ask, because that would require you to ask, how are the Uyghurs doing? How are the Tibetans doing? How are rural Han Chinese doing who have the wrong Hoku and cannot move to the cities to get jobs? They don't want you to look at that. So the whole concept of economic rights, even though instinctively people think, oh, that's what China likes, they don't like it at all, because the concept of economic rights, has this analytic bite to it. It has this, type of inquiry that they don't want. What China wants to reduce the concept of human rights to is GDP, gross domestic product. Is the economy growing? And this is comfortable terrain. This is an area where, of course, there has been enormous economic growth. It was starting from a low level, the low level of the Cultural Revolution and that devastation. But, there's no denying that China has, emerged from poverty to a middle-income country, where many people, hundreds of millions of people, have been pulled out of poverty. So this is, definitely a more comfortable domain, but we should recognize, first, that it is a radical dumbing down of what human rights are about. This says nothing about limits on the government and how they can treat people. It says nothing about the duty of a government to its people. It just asks, are you expanding the economy? And even that inquiry is a bit problematic because, was it really the government that led to this economic growth, or was it the government getting out of the way so the Chinese people could kind of finally, apply their energy and creativity to improving the economy? I would actually argue it's more the latter. The government has tended to be a problem whenever they've gotten in the way. The big problem, though, is Taiwan, because not so long ago, Taiwan and mainland China were economically the same. Today, GDP per capita in Taiwan is 3 times GDP per capita in the mainland. So suddenly, the idea that you need Chinese Communist Party rule in order to make the Chinese people rich doesn't look like it's true. In fact, maybe it's an impediment if you compare it to Taiwan. And I should say, just as an aside, this is what more than anything else has me worried about the possibility of an invasion of Taiwan. We tend to think of the problem as one of nationalism, but I think there's one of legitimacy here, because Taiwan as an independent body is threatening to the very legitimacy of Beijing. So the other thing that China is trying to do is to change the way human rights is addressed by the UN. And here there's, broad recognition that when you get to a certain level of misconduct, you face pressure. You face investigation, condemnation, the various tools that the UN has to force the government to improve its human rights practices. And the Chinese government says, no, that's inappropriate. We should have a win-win approach to human rights. We should have nice, polite conversation about how each of our sovereign countries is addressing human rights. And it's kind of like to each their own. These are all different paths to the same way. So, with the deference that a great power is due, you can talk about their human rights practices, but you can't pressure them about it. Now, this redefinition of human rights to being just growth and redefinition of the method of defending human rights to being just conversation, you can imagine that this is, sounds great if you're an autocrat. So there are some people who are willing to buy into this system. But it is not, fortunately, at this stage, how most of the world looks at this. And we can see this at the UN Human Rights Council, which, as I mentioned, is the one place in the UN system that we've been able to at least threaten China with. The Security Council is obviously out of the picture because of the Chinese veto. The General Assembly is kind of too big and unwieldy. It's not a place that's easy to operate. But the Human Rights Council is, small enough, finite enough that it poses the possibility of a condemnation. And so, Human Rights Watch has been pursuing a long-term strategy. This is not an overnight thing, but trying to build the possibility of criticism of China at the Human Rights Council. The initial problem that we faced was that everybody was afraid of economic retaliation. They all remembered Australia. They all remembered Norway. And so we would say, well, would you criticize what's happening in Xinjiang? And they would say, no way, we're not going to lose the Chinese market. And so we began approaching this through a safety in numbers strategy. We say, if you band together in a joint statement, a joint criticism of China, they can't retaliate against all of you. And so, governments began to say, okay, we can see that. Let's give it a shot. And the first time we tried this was in October 2019. In Geneva, in the context of the UN Human Rights Council, not formally at the council, just a joint statement on the outskirts of it. And we were able to persuade 25 governments to sign on to a joint statement criticizing what was happening in Xinjiang, the crimes against humanity. To give you a sense of the fear, there is a tradition at the council that when there is a joint statement of this sort, somebody then reads it out loud before the council, and nobody would read it. They were all afraid. And finally, the Brits said, all right, we'll do it, and they went in and read it, and the sky didn't fall, So, that emboldened people a little bit. We've been gradually increasing the numbers so that this past October 2022, we had 50 governments who signed on. So the numbers are mounting, and now people are willing to read it. We've been doing other things too. During the midst of the pandemic, we held a so-called high-level virtual event, really kind of semi-Security Council, but just kind of using the ambassadors in New York. And again, this was the kind of thing that China cared about. They cared so much that they issued disinvitations. So we would email everybody, you are formally invited to join us to this high-level virtual event, and they would send emails saying, you are disinvited, and basically, if you show up, we're going to retaliate. Now, fortunately, 51 governments showed up, at the ambassadorial and ministerial level. And, it was a successful event. China showed up too, and we gave them the microphone and they just dug a deeper grave because what are they going to say? Things are fine in Xinjiang. So it was, but we've been trying to, gradually build confidence and put pressure on the Chinese government. Now, one thing that we recognized is that we needed something beyond just the reports of non-governmental groups like Human Rights Watch to describe what was happening in Xinjiang. We wanted an official report. And so we began going to the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president, and said, will you do a formal investigation and a report on Xinjiang? And she agreed. And then it started going really slowly. And it was partly not her fault in that she was appropriately seeking what she called unfettered access to Xinjiang, which is what you want. If you're going to do investigation, you want to be able to walk around and talk to people, go to the prisons, go to the detention centers. And the Chinese government kept saying, no. You can come for friendly visit. We will have our nice little chit chat. Remember how we deal with human rights. And she rightfully said, no, I'm not going to waste my time. Unfettered investigation or nothing. And so this is there was a standoff, and the standoff was just not getting resolved. And I remember going to see Bachelet in October 2021. And I said, look, you got to publish whether you get access or not. Human Rights Watch these days doesn't have access either. We do remote monitoring. We use, satellite imagery, other open source information, talk to people who are in exile. You can get the information. You don't need the visit. And so she said, okay, she actually had a draft on her desk. She wasn't happy with it. But in December 2021, her spokesperson said, just a few weeks away and it'll be out. What we hadn't counted on was Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, who is horrible when it comes to China's human rights practices. And he wanted to go to the Beijing Olympics in February 2022. And, we said, how can you do this? You're going to go clap for the Olympics while crimes against humanity are being committed in Xinjiang? And he said, don't worry, I'll deal with Xinjiang. And he dealt with it all right. He went to the Olympics and said, I got the Chinese to agree to a visit for Bachelet using Beijing's term rather than her term. So he completely undercut her. And her boss basically said, you got to go for a mere visit. So she went for her visit, which was a disaster. They completely played her. They outfoxed her. It was a disaster. She, made some bad decisions herself. But she came back from this disastrous trip, and then the pressure was on her to put out her report. The Chinese did everything they could to stall. They kept throwing questions at her, more information. Finally, she had said she was resigning as of the end of August. And on August 31st at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before her term was up, she issued her report. And it was actually a good report. She described possible crimes against humanity. It was, it was strong. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that she was walking out the door, and it was going to come to her successor to follow up. But her successor is this guy by the name of Volker Turk, an Austrian diplomat, a longtime aide to Antonio Guterres, who is a classic quiet diplomat. He had no history of ever speaking out publicly for human rights. And so he, to this day, has never said a critical word about Xinjiang. He said, of course, I stand by Bachelet's report, but has never in his voice reaffirmed any of the conclusions. He has said, just yesterday or maybe this morning, he said he was very concerned that the Chinese had just given these lengthened prison terms to 2 Chinese human rights lawyers. But, very concerned is not exactly a criticism. He hasn't even been very concerned about Xinjiang. There's been zero criticism on Xinjiang. Instead, what he says is, I'm going to engage in dialogue with Beijing. we are going to have a process of engagement with Beijing. Now, this is music to the ears of Xi Jinping. You can just imagine how this is going to go. Volker Turk comes in, Mr. President, would you please treat the Uyghurs better? Good suggestion. Why don't you go discuss this with the foreign ministry? We'll give you, an office in the third sub-basement, no TV cameras, obviously no media. Come back in 2-3 years with your suggestions and we'll be happy to consider them. That's what dialogue is. That's what engagement is with the Chinese. It is not pressure. It is not something that's going to work. But Volker Turk, even though he's been willing to criticize other countries, even Russia, because everybody can criticize Russia these days, refuses to criticize the Chinese government, like his boss. So we have, a zero when it comes to Xinjiang sitting in the Palais Wilson in Geneva. Nonetheless, we decided to throw the dice and to try for the first time to get not even a resolution on Xinjiang, but to put Xinjiang on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council for the first time ever. And we made this attempt last October. Turk deliberately didn't show up in Geneva. He had been, named to the post a month before, but he was just a no-show. He was going to let the whole debate happen without him there, so we didn't have to address it. We lost, but we lost by a whisker. We lost by a vote of 17-19, with 11 abstaining. And if you dissect the vote a little bit, the no's included, for example, Indonesia, one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, basically saying we could give a damn about the Muslims of Xinjiang. The abstentions included a number of the world's biggest democracies: India, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Malaysia, even Ukraine, which is benefiting from massive Western support for its democracy, and it wouldn't even stand up to Ukraine. It abstained to Xinjiang. So, we lost, Xi Jinping won, but it was really close. And it was no grounds for comfort because, you can just imagine that it's possible to shift some of these votes. Indonesia could be moved from no to abstain. Malaysia could be moved, or Ukraine could be moved from abstain to yes. Or Mexico or Brazil, so there are, this is a flexible situation. And we are going to keep at it because if you just look at the joint statements, the trajectory is in our favor. Now, the one other thing I want to quickly mention is that we are also trying to play China's game of economic pressure, because if they can deny us access to the Chinese market, why can't Western countries deny China access to their market? It's a game you can play both ways. And I should say that, Human Rights Watch does not seek a boycott of China. That's never been our view. But we do believe that trade should not be complicit in human rights violations. It should not bolster human rights violations. And so we were big supporters of what in the United States was called the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which became effective just a year ago in June, and presumptively denies the import of anything from Xinjiang unless you can prove that it was not the product of forced labor, which you cannot prove because there's no transparency. So basically, it's a complete bar of any cotton, any tomatoes, any polysilicon coming out of Xinjiang. Those are the big exports. The European Union had negotiated an investment deal with China. We were not happy with this. I was dealing with Angela Merkel at the end of her term as chancellor when she was also president of the European Union. And she was so desperate to have this investment deal that she kind of gave away the store. Even though you would think Europe wouldn't want to invest in forced labor, she was willing to accept, not an end to the forced labor, not formal ratification of the International Labor Organization treaties against forced labor, but rather the Chinese government agreeing to think about perhaps someday down the road, maybe ratifying the treaty. That was all the draft agreement required. Now, the Chinese government actually did ratify one of the treaties, but they blew it because there was a tit for tat of sanctions. Beijing made the mistake of imposing sanctions on a few European parliamentarians, and they said there is no way we're going to ever approve this investment deal while you're sanctioning us. And so the thing was basically killed for 2 years. Just like a week ago, the Chinese ambassador to the European Union said, oh, let's let bygones be bygones. We'll lift the sanctions and you let the investment deal go forward. And that didn't last very long because Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, just joined Macron in the visit to Beijing. And while Macron got the royal treatment because he's very accommodationist and is trying to, present a middle ground between the United States and China, von der Leyen is tougher on China. They completely snubbed her and she walked off and said, there is going to be no investment deal. It is over with. So they kind of shot themselves in the foot on that one. The one final thing I wanted to say is that one thing China has always had going for it is this argument that its autocratic model is superior to the messiness of Western democracies. And, this, of course, is also an argument that Putin and various other autocrats like to make. But what the last, year or two has shown is that when you surround yourself by sycophants, when you don't allow public debate about your decisions, when you try to run a country as vast as China with one guy sitting in Beijing making the key decisions, you make big mistakes. And we've seen these mistakes, whether it's, covering up COVID-19 when it emerged in Wuhan, imposing these endless lockdowns that were decimating the economy. Then, in the face of the protests I mentioned, abruptly lifting the lockdowns without making any of the most basic preparation in terms of, building intensive care units or vaccinating elderly Chinese, or even allowing the mRNA vaccines, which work much better than the Chinese vaccines, into the country. None of this. And of course, we don't know the exact death numbers, but if you just judge by the, the mobs at the hospitals, the overworked morgues, it was not good. He's also, been so concerned about anybody having power separate from him that he's undermined the most vigorous parts of the economy, the tech firms, just kind of put them in their place, but, killed that part of the economy in the process. He has, been so intent on using debt and real estate to drive the economy that he's created a debt crisis and complete overbuilding and obviously various economic problems for some of the biggest firms like Evergrande. He's got big demographic problems that are a product of, before Xi, but very much Communist Chinese Party policy of, the echoes of the one-child policy, the difficulties of sort of living in this system and having a family. And so there is too many older people compared to, people being born and a shrinking population. And so, all of this shows, just illustrates the kind of poor decisions that can be made when you don't allow public debate. And you can make the same point about, Putin invading Ukraine or, Erdogan lowering interest rates to fight inflation or, just you kind of go around the world and they have a pretty bad record. So far, Beijing's response to the various forms of pressure, to its problem of legitimacy, has been more to kind of reshuffle the pieces on the chessboard than to make any progress. If you look at what they've done on Xinjiang, at first they were denying that there were any detention centers. Then they say, oh, really? Yeah, they're vocational training centers. These are not detention centers. There's no forced indoctrination happening. These days, they're shutting down the detention centers and putting people in prison with criminal sentences. They're putting people into forced labor. These are not improvements. They're just variations. But what it shows is that they are, ultra sensitive to this kind of criticism. They really are putting an enormous effort into denying, covering up, and trying to, somehow fend off criticism. Xi Jinping even was calling leaders to say, vote with us at the Human Rights Council. That's how much it mattered to them. So what I take from this is that, if you judge from, is there improvement in human rights in China? No, at this point, I can't say that there is. Is the Chinese government showing that it is sensitive to the kind of pressure that we're able to mount? Yes. Do we know over time from our work around the world that this kind of pressure changes the cost-benefit analysis of repression and tends to diminish repression over time? That we know. Is this going to be an immediate solution? No way. When you're dealing with a country as big and powerful as China, you've got to have a long-term approach. But I'm confident that we are making progress in building the pressure. And I hope that pressure over time yields improvements in China's record. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Those were some, well, as often the case with the subject of human rights in China, some gloomy remarks overall. I wanted to, you touched on a number of areas I wanted to ask you about. We don't have a ton of time, so I will try and ask the perfect question. But you talked about the trajectory being positive on putting pressure on China, the number of people, number of countries signing, government signing the joint statement on Xinjiang and other human rights violations that they've done at the UN and the Human Rights Council every year. That has grown, but I do think you could also make the kind of converse argument that the trajectory of China's influence at the UN has also been positive for China, and to the detriment of accountability on human rights. While at the same time, the human rights situation has worsened in China, right? We had a period with the camps in Xinjiang, with the crackdown in Hong Kong, during which the UN Human Rights Council said nothing at its peak, other than the joint statements outside of the Human Rights Council, during which the High Commissioner made no statement, no clear statement, until the final minutes that she was in office. And you did talk about Gutierrez's role in that, but it's also fell on her. I mean, she waited a very long time, even before the December 2021 comment about a report coming out. She didn't show up at that virtual high-level meeting where she was invited to speak or even to appear. I want to talk about, I mean, do you think the UN human rights system can cope with Chinese influence and overcome it? I mean, do you see much evidence that it can grapple with Chinese influence in a meaningful way when, during the entire time of the Human Rights Council's existence, it's never considered a resolution on Chinese human rights violation, and the closest it came was a resolution to talk about a resolution?
No, I mean, yeah, there's no question that the UN Human Rights Council, the UN system, has a hard time dealing with what you say is the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. It has never criticized any of them until Russia, now with Ukraine. So that's just what you're dealing with. We are, I think, moving in the direction, if you look at the kind of, I mean, it's always useful to divide the UN into 2 parts. The UN as an operational place where, Guterres is in charge, and then the UN as a conference room where governments show up and use the conference room. If you talk about the UN as a conference room, I would say China's influence is diminishing. And to give an example, in I forget it was 19 or 2020, but when it ran for a seat on the Human Rights Council 4 years ago, I guess it would have been, it came in first among the Asia Pacific candidates. When it ran a year ago, it came in last among the 4 successful candidates. Only one other candidate was put forward, Saudi Arabia, and they lost. So I was happy that they lost. But if the Asia Pacific region had put forward one more candidate, China might have lost. But to go from first to 4th last was indicative of its diminished esteem. When China came forward and said, we would like to back as the president of the Human Rights Council, the ambassador from Bahrain, who was basically a Saudi clone, they lost again. Fiji was elected, which was seen as kind of, a pro-democratic member of the Asia Pacific region. So, these are, examples to show that China doesn't always get its way. Now, within the Secretariat, the UN is an operational body. I mean, as I mentioned, Guterres has been horrible. A different individual could have made different decisions. I think, Kofi Annan today would have been much more outspoken. Even Ban Ki-moon would have been more outspoken. But Guterres is, just a bit too smart for his own good. He thinks he's got it all figured out. He's going to, use his great influence to quietly persuade China. And of course, he's got no capacity to quietly persuade anybody. All he has is his public voice. But he, is controlling Vulgar Turk. And so they talk about engagement and who's going to be against engagement. But what that really means is no criticism, no pressure. And so nothing is going to get done. So my feeling is that China is vulnerable, that the trajectory is not necessarily in its direction. And you see this also in kind of, where China's been backing different candidates for other positions and not getting them. So its glamour is diminishing. Its clout is diminishing because BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is no longer a big thing. And it's got economic problems, so it has less money to spread around. So I think that this is doable. Is it going to be easy? No. But I do think that, within a year or two, we should be able to get something on China in a UN multilateral context.
And I should say, by the way, that in a little bit of time, we're going to have questions from the audience. So just remind you to kind of be forming them, and we'd like to put questions from all of you out there to Ken. And what do you think is going to be? What is your outlook for the actual impact on human rights in China and on its rhetoric, on its actual? I mean, you've made some statements about what you think is Xi Jinping's kind of his weaknesses long term. Does that speaks to me of maybe you have a little bit of optimism that that there will be some change within China. I don't know that I don't know if I'm reading into that, and I don't necessarily share that optimism. But I was wondering what your outlook is for the possibilities for an improvement in human rights in China.
Yeah. No, I mean, I didn't mean to imply that I think Xi Jinping is going to be ousted. I mean, I have no evidence to support that. So, he seems to have been quite effective in marginalizing opposition. I was just sort of taken by the recent party Congress, and you just see this incredibly regimented system where everybody's dressed alike, applauding the same way. It's just, I mean, it's horrible. It's sort of the antithesis of spontaneity, but it's a display of power. So him saying, look, I can force everybody in a senior position to act exactly as I ask them to. And that's a certain vision of power. I think it's brittle, but you can't predict how long it lasts. So, but I do, sort of start from the premise that there's a rationale for his repression. I mean, why are things so much worse today than they have been at any time since the Tiananmen Square crackdown? I don't think it's just like he's temperamentally a dictator. It's that he's scared. He feels that this is what he needs to do just to keep in power.
Right. I think I did kind of seize upon that in the early part of your remarks. I think it's probably a feature, not a bug, of a dictatorship to be paranoid that that the people will rise up against you. And I would say that he's been pretty effective, and that would explain to some degree the worsening human rights situation. I mean, the way that he's treated Uyghurs, the way that he's treated Mongolians and Tibetans plays into that, right? And so that's why I'm kind of wondering about, the next 5 or 10 year outlook, where you could see that economic pressure, as you talked about, or action in the UN, or action by Human Rights Watch. I mean, what do you think could be possibly effective that would actually move the needle on actual on the ground human rights in China? I mean, we had a long stretch here of 20 years, I would say, of gradually worsening, gradually up until, I would say, 2017 with the camps in Xinjiang, and then the crackdown in Hong Kong, and when it got significantly worse. Have you seen any cracks for hope where things go in point in the other direction? And what would it take, do you think, to open some cracks?
Well, look, I think the one big unknown here is the state of the economy. And, the imposed bargain has been, I, Xi Jinping, will make you richer, you let me be the dictator. And it's not clear that Xi Jinping is going to keep up his side of that imposed bargain. I'm not sure that it's going to start going to, negative growth, but it's clearly going to slow down. And so this idea that, people are getting perceptively richer and therefore are willing to put up with a dictatorship, I think that's going to be a tougher case to make. So, what does that mean? I mean, I think that the protests over the lockdowns were interesting because these were, completely middle-class protests. Some people were sort of speaking out against Xi Jinping, which was really not done, So I can understand why he moved so quickly because this was a terrifying development. I think there are various, indications of discontent, even in terms of people not having children or, dropping out of the workforce or whatever. People are kind of not happy with their life right now. So it's hard to see what the alternative is right now because the Communist Party is so omnipresent. But it's not a secure situation. So it's hard to kind of predict this. And the problem with this kind of insecurity is, of course, it can intensify the incentive to repress. It doesn't necessarily mean that things get better. They can get worse. But it does mean that I think his grasp on power is going to be a bit more precarious because at some point you got to say, what is he delivering? And people will ask that question.
One area that you didn't really touch on was about kind of China's extraterritorial efforts at censorship and pressure. I was wondering if you could speak to that, where you are most concerned about that and where you see that intensifying.
Okay, well, maybe since we're sitting here at a university, we should talk about what happens in universities. Because, there is a widespread fear that I've seen among Chinese students that they cannot speak negatively about Beijing or others will report them and their parents back home will get a visit from the police, and that's a big problem. I would like to see universities take a more proactive role on that. I mean, they can't sit there and monitor WeChat. They can't stop this. There's no way to prevent what happens back in China. But I would like to see universities say that this violates academic freedom for pressure to be put on Chinese students not to criticize the Chinese government, that we uphold the right to speak for or against the Chinese government. Now, any given university is always afraid to do that because Chinese students tend to pay full fare. They tend not to be scholarship students, and so they get these big tuition payments. And they're all worried about facing economic retaliation. The answer to this, and I've discussed this with a few different universities, is take the top 20 private universities, band together, and put out a joint statement upholding academic freedom in the context of discussion of China. This is entirely within the capacity to do. This would be the right thing to do. It would go a long way toward making the university experience, kind of a fuller experience for students here who wouldn't feel that they had to self-censorship quite as much. I think they would still face the pressure because, how would you ever know what happens back in China? But even making the statement that, you could be expelled if you are party to a censorship effort would be an important statement.
I think I'll have one more question before we go to the audience, so be ready. One thing I wanted to get into, which is slightly kind of taking the flip side of this, was the response to the increasing influence of China in the US, in Australia, and other parts of the world, where for years there was, I would say, indifference or complacency. They pulled a 180 during the last 5-6 years, where you had quite a forceful response to the threat of Chinese influence, the China threat, and some would say perhaps went too far in some ways, right? And I'm thinking when I speak of that, of like the China initiative, investigating researchers at universities in the US for having perhaps secret contracts with China, some of which may have been very valid kind of investigations into dual use of of their research, but which led to hundreds of people being under scrutiny, and most of them of Chinese ethnicity. So that's just to take one example. I was wondering if you felt that there were excesses in the response. I mean, you probably, whether you welcomed at one point on one hand, more scrutiny of Chinese influence abroad, but on the other, do you have concerns?
No, my concern is that there's a difference between the Chinese government and the Chinese people. And, it's perfectly legitimate to try to prevent Chinese government espionage, Chinese government theft of, secrets that'll be of use in particularly for military application. It is not right to say every ethnic Chinese person is a point of suspicion. And, this came to a head with COVID, with Trump, saying the Chinese virus, it really turned into anti-Chinese sentiment, and that's wrong. So I think it's very important to distinguish between the people and the government. And particularly when the people have very little say in what the government does, it is utterly unfair to equate the two. And so that is where I think it's gone too far. And, obviously Trump had zero leadership on this. Biden is capable of making that distinction, but hasn't made the effort to.
Thanks, Ken. I think we should go to questions from the audience, and I have one in the back. Nesun, would you like to come up to the microphone? If you have questions, go ahead and line up there.
I staked out my position here so I could ask a question. First of all, thank you for the very stimulating comments, and Gadi for your great questions. I really hope someone will take up the invitation of your last question, the last exchange, to continue that dialogue. But what I want to ask about has to do with something that I think was both in your comments and your question, that maybe there's a long-term view to be had here with respect to China, and how do we prepare for that? And the very precise question I have is, what is your vision of US-China engagement if there is a long-term story here? Because we're in a moment now where this terminology of engagement has basically been completely delegitimized within our own American political discourse. The very particular circumstance that I'm familiar with is the rule of law community and the rule of law exchanges that we've had for many years. You suggest in your comments that that's over. What I can tell you from decades of work in this area is that 95 to 99% of the people in China who worked on those issues still have their jobs, are still within the system, and are still pushing. So what I'm very curious about is, what are the political conditions in the US that allow me to continue working with them? They're not dissidents, they're not trying to flee, they're still doing the best that they can within the system. And what I worry about the most is, can I still be the kind of support for them that I've tried to be in the past, given our own American political discourse about engagement?
Let me answer you in two ways. One specifically on the rule of law programs. I actually took part in some of those dialogues myself, and there was some modest progress made. I remember we got rid of re-education through labor. We didn't get rid of, all forms of administrative detention, but that was one, and that was something, So, but this was what, 10 years ago? This was a different era. I'm not sure that we could make much progress today, even in these kind of largely apolitical realms, although re-education through labor was used politically. But on your broader point about education, of engagement, engagement just meaning dialogue, exchange, meetings, that's all fine. We don't want to stop that. Engagement, the way Antonio Guterres means it, or the way Will Volker Turk means it, which is, quiet discussion in lieu of pressure, is ridiculous. It's just, a kind of an excuse for doing nothing. It's an excuse for accepting the status quo. And so maybe we need different terms. Maybe if engagement is a dirty word right now because it means not pressure, maybe you should be talking about, continuing to have rule of law exchanges. Just be, more specific about it, because, that's a good thing to do. But I think that, I don't think anybody really opposes dialogue. It's dialogue when it's a substitute for pressure, because at this point, to make any significant difference, it's only going to be pressure that's going to make a difference.
Next question.
Hi. Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. So my question is related to China's use of economic leverage, whether it's through the Belt and Road Initiative or other paths in order to gain support for its human rights violations in Xinjiang. So in general, China has kind of tended to put money through the BRI in areas that the US and possibly other Western countries have historically neglected. So I'm wondering, in order to gain support from countries such as Indonesia or Pakistan, which are countries that have very strong economic ties with China through the Belt and Road Initiative, but also through avenues such as other forms of direct investment or trade, does the US and other Western countries kind of have to fight money with money in the sense that they need to put more money into these countries to try and gain their support? Or are there or do you see other avenues that they can use in order to gain support?
No, that's a good question. I think the Belt and Road Initiative is double-edged. I mean, on the one hand, who can be against investing in infrastructure where there's a need? So, and if Western countries were not providing the money and the money's coming from China, why not? At that level, it's a good thing. The problem was the way it was done. And BRI was, essentially, and I don't think this is really overstating it, it was essentially an invitation to corruption. By having zero transparency, zero scrutiny, it essentially was buying off the elites of a government by saying, we don't care if you give us inflated prices, we don't care if you scrape off 20%, just be loyal to us. That's what it takes to buy your votes at the UN, fine. And so the end result is these debt traps, the Sri Lankan port everybody knows about, but, I was just in Nairobi in June, and, one famous project is the Mombasa-Nairobi Railroad, which was so overpriced and so economically unviable that the Kenyan government tried to prevent truckers from trucking between the two to force people to use the railroad. In both Nairobi and Kampala, there were brand new highways the Chinese built. And the one hand you say, that's good. I've been in those traffic jams. Those are horrible traffic jams, Suddenly there's this nice, elevated highway, which nobody was using because it's a toll road to pay off the loan. And so the traffic jam was still there. You just had this nice highway above for the people who could afford to pay. These are the kinds of things that happen when there's no accountability, no transparency. So it's not a matter of just the West putting in money, because if the West puts in money, they're going to do it in World Bank terms, which is with transparency, with civil society participation, with media scrutiny, as it should. And you're not going to get some of these projects because they're not viable projects. And it's not going to be as attractive to the people who wanted to be bought off by the Chinese and who are happy to be padding their Swiss bank account. So it's a little different, it's a little more complicated than just saying the Chinese are providing money that the West should. You got to look at how that money is being provided.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
I'm not sure if I should call this question or my view on this is because I basically see this situation as US doesn't have much card to win this because US economy itself is so mired into with China's economy. And it almost seems like situation akin to US relation between Saudi and US, so that US do not criticize the gross human rights violation in Saudi and Middle East because of the relation with oil there, and China, its relation is there. And I think because of the US doesn't have much leverage there. But I'm not sure what is your view on that, because I never liked this kind of relation, but US go ahead with it, and that kind of,
No, you're right that there is, enormous economic, closeness relationship between the US and China. Most of that is not going to go away, nor should it. The fact that the US purchases a lot of Chinese goods, that they, invest to some extent in China, there's no reason for that to stop. The pressure to stop trade really focuses on things like, are you importing the product of Uyghur forced labor? Are you sending the Chinese government the tools for it to build its surveillance state? So it's really should be much more focused. Now, Trump, obviously raised tariffs across the board. That was not about human rights. That was about, just Trump being Trump, and Biden has not been willing to lower those because he doesn't want to, have to pay the price from the Republicans. But I think it's possible to have these close economic relationships because most of them, China has an incentive they don't want to cut off sales to the United States. So a lot of this can happen consistent with pressure around human rights. Even in Saudi Arabia, the US condemned the Khashoggi murder. The US, helped get the scrutiny of this Saudi-led coalition's bombing in Yemen. They were able to do this. In the end, Biden went as a supplicant and did his fist bump with the Saudi Crown Prince to try to get a little more oil. That was, I think, widely seen as a real low point of his presidency and a big mistake. So I don't think the economic connections preclude the sort of targeted pressure that can make a difference.
I do think that you won't be seeing Biden fist pump with Xi Jinping, though. Next question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and for being here. One thing that your story about the report and the Olympics brought to mind was this need for greater coordination or consistency between not only the UN and its agencies, but international organizations in general. And I wanted to ask, what your thoughts were on how we can create the space for more coordination in the international system, and building off, insights offered by Robert Putnam's model on two-level games. What role does civil society play in shaping those win sets, and how can we make it that there is greater consistency to send a strong message to China that you can't keep getting away with this?
Okay, now those are good questions. In terms of the role of civil society, look, I'm obviously coming from civil society, but, my experience is that civil society is an absolutely essential catalyst to getting things done. We're a source of information about what's happening, but we're also a source of ideas and strategy. And so a lot of things that happen on China or any other country are because Human Rights Watch or one of our allies suggests it and rounds up the troops and makes it happen. And we obviously work with governments. We don't have a vote at the UN. We don't have standing at the UN. We have to work through governments. But that partnership is essential for getting things done. And it's almost natural. Governments, they're not used to thinking through these options. They're a bit more status quo oriented. And it's up to us to say, okay, this is what you could do. We think this could work. And then we have to persuade them. And it doesn't always work, but it works a lot of the time. In terms of, coordination, be careful what you wish for, because, if we're coordinating under Antonio Guterres, we're going to be coordinating silence. So I actually think it's useful to have a bit of diversity. If you look at Dr. Tedros, head of the World Health Organization, this is a UN agency, but he's now been willing to be much more critical about China and the cover up of, what happened in Wuhan with the outbreak of the pandemic. If he were sort of taking orders from Guterres, I'm sure Guterres would tell him not to do this. Guterres couldn't completely control Bachelet, so he put his pawn in there, Volker Turk. So it's, given who's the guy at the top, and we're stuck with him for another 4 years, a little diversity in leadership is not a bad thing.
Can we have about 6 minutes? And I wanted to ask you a very quick question so that we could get a question from a student as well. I guess I'm a little concerned about, not concerned, so your analysis about the UN and what's possible there. And I think for people who aren't like deeply knowledgeable about the UN, there is a little bit of like the function of the council and what does a resolution mean and questions about that. But you made a point of saying two things. So one, there are these joint statements and that's progress. And I would say that we risk maybe a little bit with China, believing that something's better than nothing and that a certain incrementalism is inevitable. So I would ask you, in looking at the possibilities at the UN system in particular, so the joint statements, then the near vote to get China on the agenda for the Human Rights Council doesn't feel like a lot, but maybe you could just say why, if you had been able to achieve getting them on the council's agenda, that would be an actual achievement, would mean something.
Could I add just one bit to that question? Because if you could also address at the same time the whole kind of question of the debate amongst governments and amongst human rights groups about whether to even bring forward a question when you know you might lose the vote.
Yeah.
I think that's an important part of this whole.
Right. No, look, I think you could say at a certain level, why does any of this matter? It matters because China cares. And it almost doesn't matter what the next step is. Like these joint statements, they care desperately. Every time we put out a joint statement, they put out a joint counter statement, signed by the dictators and thugs of the world saying, things are wonderful in Xinjiang. Why do they bother? So they care about this. They fought tooth and nail to avoid getting it on the agenda because it was just a blow to their prestige. It undermined their legitimacy. And I get back to what I said at the outset, when you don't have elections, when you don't have any really domestic source of legitimacy, you care about these international manifestations of acceptance. And so if instead you're getting international condemnation in some form, that harms you. So it's, you can say just putting it on the agenda, that was the next step. That was the feasible thing. We didn't have the votes for condemnation. We were close to having the votes for an agenda item, a discussion. And, you just go incrementally as best you can. The debate about, should we risk losing? And that's a fair question. There are well-intentioned governments who say, we're not sure. It'd be worse to lose than maybe we should not venture. They tend to be very cautious with that. We tend to be a little bit more out there and willing to try. I am not bothered by having lost here. It was such a close loss that it was kind of a win, and I think people, they're aware of the coercion that went into the votes against us. It's just seen as sort of, part of a gradual process. So I'm willing to put up with that.
I don't know if you can discuss it, but I seem to recall that you had an argument with a previous U.S. ambassador to the UN about this topic, didn't you? Or
with Nikki Haley, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, that was a different item. That was, we can talk about that, but that was about Israel. That was about really her just trying to destroy the UN Human Rights Council so it wouldn't criticize Israel, to put it in, bluntly.
Well, another one of your favorite topics we can get into. Let's get to
another forum.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for speaking with us today. And I'm asking this question on behalf of Chinese students and also Chinese people who are working on human rights issues in China. I know we had a tremendous protest last year, but while I was part of it, I still think I am, but I just feel we are losing the momentum and we didn't have an agenda at that time. I know Nathan Law was here at Perry World House days before, but I don't think we can do exactly the same as they did in Hong Kong. So I'm kind of want to ask that for Chinese students and for Chinese people, are there any ways that we can work globally and collectively with other people from, other nations and also with UN? Because I don't see ourselves forcing, forming agendas because it's not a safe space for us to do that.
Right. Yeah, no, first of all, I think you're right that the protests, the anti-lockdown protests were, of course, they were ephemeral. Protests never last forever, and so I wouldn't despair about that. They were incredibly powerful when they happened. And they, to see Xi Jinping change like that was really remarkable. So they were powerful and effective. If you ask, what can you do today? I'm not sure I can give you advice that quickly, but my sense, and you're in a better position to answer this than I am, is that WeChat, which is very important, is too much of an echo chamber. And that there are many Chinese students, you're obviously not among them, who just drink this pro-Beijing propaganda on WeChat and never see anything else. And just, they're here, they are living in the West. They could pick up the New York Times every day, but they just get their news from WeChat and it's all the Beijing line. And I think that there is an important role for Chinese students to try to break through that And it could be as simple as putting Mandarin translations of New York Times articles on WeChat, or, I mean, I don't know, what that might get you in trouble, because then you're seen as, posting anti-China material. But, something breaking through the pro-Beijing slant of WeChat would be very important to do. And I don't know precisely how to do that, but my sense is that that needs to be done. And that's something that is really talking about what's happening here among the Chinese students.
I would just add that, I mean, it's quite evident that Chinese students are in an extremely difficult position. They're placed in an extremely difficult position abroad. And I think the first priority is to take care of yourself, and to be safe.
Exactly. It really, it's what's feasible is it's a whole different thing. And there may be ways to do this anonymously. I don't know, if, or to have, pseudonyms, and you post on the pseudonym. We can't work out the details here, but yes, you don't want to do something that's going to get yourself in trouble. But if there's a way consistent with your safety to spread alternative points of view, that would be useful to do.
Yeah, I'm definitely a WeChat abolitionist, and also I'm introducing the pranks, the podcast to my friends. So yeah.
Okay.
Well, I feel improper being the final question, but I'll ask it anyway. I'm concerned about the Taiwan problem. And I'm concerned about, based on what you've said, that Xi Jinping sees Taiwan as that last group of people who don't listen to me, so I have to run over them. And my concern, as an American is, well, what about protecting them? And what can be done to change, if at all, his views? I mean, what is it that could be done to get him to say, well, maybe I should rethink the question? And the reason I say that is I do know a little bit about his history. And was it he or his father who was in jail, who was imprisoned?
His father.
His father. And I've always fascinated why a guy whose father was imprisoned by this party is like worse than the people who imprisoned his party. And I wondered the connection between that history and the future.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to your question on that, we were talking about this earlier, is you should listen to the podcast, The Prince, that The Economist put out, which does the psychoanalysis of Xi Jinping and why he would, parrot his father's persecutors. In terms of Taiwan, look, there are enormous incentives for Xi Jinping to take Taiwan. There's this, the fact that it's a counterexample to the benevolence of the Chinese Communist Party as a development tool. There's the wag the dog problem, that if he's in trouble politically at home, which he easily could be if the economy slows down, there's nothing like a war to build popularity. Invading Taiwan is popular in many respects. What can be done? I mean, I think Ukraine is the biggest warning to Xi Jinping. And I mean, I'm not a military expert, and I'm not going to give military advice. There's all this talk about, turning Taiwan into a porcupine that is just going to cause problems if you take it. I mean, I can't get into details on that. I have no idea. But clearly, there have to be reasons to force Xi Jinping to think twice, because, the wag the dog phenomenon works well only if you win. If you get, a stalemate, as Putin has discovered, it's bad news for your popularity. Putin's in trouble.
I would just add that the best hope, I think, you're not going to change Xi Jinping's mind, but the best hope is, I think, to keep pushing the timeline back as far as possible, where it always seems like should be still years away for him to feel like it's worth the risk. And I think we're in that kind of stage now where perhaps a decade from now, he'll still think he's years away from an optimal time to invade Taiwan. I think at some point, that's something that's going to be a long-term goal. And the goal, I think, outside of Taiwan in the West and elsewhere is to keep that as a long-term goal for as long as possible.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. So can we please give our guests a round of applause? It's been an extraordinarily sophisticated discussion covering a lot of terrain, and I hope that you all are left feeling hopeful But I also think that there's lots of work to be done at the level of the UN. And it's clear that civil society within China is the real solution, actually, along with the pressure points that happen at the international level. So I wanted to thank our guests, thank Ken in particular, and obviously thank Gadi for his excellent moderation. And thank you all for turning out today. I wanted to share a few pieces of news with you about the coming week. As some of you all know, we have a Global Lens series whereby we examine global policy issues through a more cultural lens. We're going to be having a special program that looks at the role of photography in documenting human rights abuses and war crimes on the 17th of April in the same room at noon. Second, on the following day, on April 18th, we're going to have a program on stopping the next pandemic, the role of animals in disease transmission. So we hope that you will sign up online, come in person, and join us online for those programs. We also wanted to say that you'll be able to find a YouTube recording of this program in a couple of days online. And we hope that you will join our mailing list, follow us on social media, look at our website for additional information, and almost most important, join us for a proper reception behind us in the student lounge with our guests. So thank you very much.